Right. Well, I don't know that I've ever had that welcome, but I'll take it. I want to start off with just something I was reading. Hey, baby. I know that boldly stated thus, this idea may test some people's credulity. If I am sincere, the reader will be tempted to label me a fanatic. If I am not sincere, he will be tempted to label me an egotist. And yet the only sin I have committed has been to take the statements of Jesus seriously and try to apply them in my life. All I can do is to beg you not to be too harsh in your judgments until you too try applying Jesus' promises in your own life and see if the results will not equal or transcend anything that I have recorded. You remember that in the first chapter I stated that this was not only an autobiography of me, but a biography of you, dear cousin reader. If you would follow up the reading of this book with a week at Camp Farthest Out, under leaders like Frank Laubach, Glenn Harding, and Star Daly, where you can see the idea made flesh, you would know what I mean. I've learned that idea. Coming from a place of Christian education, coming from a place of church leadership, coming from a place of giftedness, talent, anointing. Coming from all of those things, I stepped into something I had never seen before. About 5 years ago. And I'll tell you a little bit of the story. I definitely don't have time to tell you the whole story. But I've learned that all the glory, all the giftedness, all the anointedness, all the talent, it all means nothing if I'm taking that glory. And just to be absolutely transparent, because that's what we are here, that's exactly what I did for 16 years, and I don't count my first 10 because I was under the age of 10. I was born and raised in Wichita, Kansas, and had a really strong Christian foundation. My grandmother would take us to church every Sunday morning. I would go over Saturday night and stay the night and go Sunday. And I built this foundation that I had no idea I was building because I was just a child. And it was this beautiful thing that my grandmother did for me. And when I was 10 years old, I went through a few things that no child should ever have to go through. I lost my brother, who was 6 years old. I was 10. He passed away through complications from a surgery. And simultaneously, my father and mother went through the roughest divorce I've ever seen in my life, because my dad was dealing drugs and worse. And it was just really, really, really ugly. And I was 10, and I had to figure this out. And I was with my mom. It was just me and her, and we moved in with my grandparents. And I don't know that I really got it or understood it for years and years later. In fact, just a few years ago, I really understood what was happening. But a year later, after Zach passed away, after my dad had left, I decided that God was who I wanted to follow, and I gave my life to God. I gave my life to Christ, and it was fully sincere, fully everything you expect of 11-year-old boy coming to Jesus. And not too long after, I decided to be a youth pastor. It was what my calling was, is what I wanted to do. And this is where things start to turn for me. And it wasn't any longer true anointedness. I don't believe. As a 10-year-old, you're not emotionally stable. You're learning, you're figuring things out. This whole wide world is big and crazy, and as soon as I lost that, I went through this huge tragic event, and then all of a sudden I had to fix it. I had to do something about it, right? And I remember sitting at my brother's funeral. I went to a really big church in Wichita. It would be considered a mega church in Wichita, which was 1,500 to 2,000 people. And so it had a huge sanctuary. I mean, to know the church science of it, for every 2 people, you want 3 seats next to them. It's a big sanctuary. You don't want it overfull. Things like that. So it's a giant sanctuary. I remember walking into the funeral when I was 10 years old, and I looked around, and I had never seen this church as full as it was for a 6-year-old boy. We have balcony, standing room only. It was just massive amounts of people. Everybody that I had ever met in my life were there. And it took me, like I said, 3 or 4 years to really comprehend what seed was laid that day when I saw all those people. And what I came up with, and what I believed was a true God calling, was that if Zach could change the lives of that many people in a life of 6 years, what could I do with a life, a full-blown life of 60, 70, 80 years? What could I do? And I sought it. I did everything to the T. I went to church. As soon as I was sophomore in high school, I was teaching in middle school Sunday school. I launched with my peers a youth service in the church that still goes today. I did these things. I was the leader. I was the right-hand man of the youth pastor. I was doing all of these great things. I was speaking at church camp. I was preaching in the youth service. I was doing all of these awesome things that everybody looked up to and revered. And I was good at it. I knew it. And I ended up going to Christian college, in Manhattan Christian College in Manhattan, Kansas, and I studied youth ministry. Ended up with a major that you can ask about me later because it's massive and a long story in itself, and worth nothing. And I got to this point after college where I was wandering around Manhattan, trying to figure out what I was going to do with this $100,000 piece of paper and the rest of my life. And I decided, because nothing was happening, this was the beginning, nothing was happening for me job-wise. I couldn't really find anything. I wasn't truly looking. Don't get me wrong. I wasn't putting out a ton of applications and resumes, but nothing was naturally happening like it seemed to be happening for my friends. And I didn't understand why. And I went and interned at a camp in just outside of Manhattan called Living Water Ranch. And this is when things really started to switch for me. And it was, little things, little comments. I remember picking up the practice of tithing for the first time when I was at this camp, because my boss, the camp director, we had our own little church in a room like this of probably 10, 15 people on Sundays, because we couldn't leave the camp on Sunday mornings. And he spoke, it seemed like, ask Carissa, seemed like every other Sunday he would talk about money. And just how it's not ours, and how we are called to give back in thanks, and what that meant. And I didn't understand that before. It was always, and I drug my feet, but I ended up doing it, and I ended up understanding it pretty quickly, because God, you can test God in it, right? And it was this beautiful thing. Well, I started to, so these little things start to happening. And then this camp, everybody knows this part, this camp shows up. We're hosting for the weekend, and everybody in the room is 60 plus, except for 3 or 4 maybe, and there was only one that was my age or near it. And the camp director and his wife kind of took me in as their son, their kind of adopted son a little bit. And that one person, you guys know very well, is Carissa Cooper, came up and she was actually speaking at the camp. And I had noticed her. It wasn't like I was blind. And Lisa, the camp director's wife, turned to me and was like, "TJ, would you like to help this young lady?" And with a couple winks and a nudge, and I was like, "Yes, of course." And my life began to really change in a way that I can't explain. And it's not Carissa. It's not her. It's not anyone in this room. It's not me. It was just by the grace of God that I met these people. I met this new world I had never experienced before. And I gained precious relationships and mentorships, and just leaders to follow. And it was just this really beautiful thing. And through this, I still sought out youth ministry, right? I still sought out everything that I thought I was meant to do for the rest of my life. I sought out this calling, this anointing, this talent. I sought it out with everything I was. And for whatever reason, it wasn't happening. It just wasn't. And when I say it wasn't, it was happening, but it wasn't happening on my terms. It was little itty bitty, like high-end, high-capacity volunteer jobs. It was interim positions that I wasn't truly happy with. It was speaking at different things, just leading small groups and things like this, but it wasn't, I was never the guy at the church, right? I was never the youth pastor, the hired-on youth pastor, and I struggled with that. I could not get it. I couldn't understand. I was like, this is what I'm built for. And this conversation began between Carissa and I about what and who and how the church really worked. And I began to attend these camps as CFO, I saw something different about these people, and I remember one of the first moments I realized that it was time for me to move to Nebraska was where everybody's from, the Coopers, and I went, and so a month after Carissa and I met, I took this shot in the dark. If you've ever seen Good Will Hunting, it was my time to go see about a girl. And I went and I spent time with this family, and it was a family that I had never met other than one, and it was a family like I had never seen before. And it was this family that got each other, that loved each other on a level that I had never seen, personally or even around my world. And I didn't understand why. And we stood up and we sung songs around before the dinner table, and that was weird to me. And we when we had conversation, we truly cared. It was something that I remember. It was tracking back when I can look back now and I can say the moment I fell in love with Carissa was honestly the first conversation I had with her, and it's because she had this sincerity in wanting to know me and wanting to know who I was and what my passions were in a way not even all the followers of the world that I had ever done. And I didn't get it. And it intrigued me. And I had to chase it with everything I had. And ended up in Nebraska a month later. 2 months later, I was moving to Nebraska. 6 months later, I was engaged. 6 months later, I was married. 6 months later, I was living in West Virginia. Oh, that's the short part of the story. It was crazy. It was absolutely crazy. And this conversation continued as I continued to try and jump from bachelorhood to married life to expecting a child to having a daughter, and still seeking this thing that was out there that the world and I told myself I needed and I had to have and I was built for. And through this long journey, I mean, it's been every bit of 5 years now. I have realized that the church is so much more than what I had made it, and that I was doing everything God called me to do without ever having a paycheck signed off by a church. And that was a shift for me. That was a big shift that it was huge. And what I realized more and more as I dug into this, why was I so bent on this? I realized that what I was doing was I was trying to live up to a person rather than a God. And he was my brother. I was looking at that funeral, and I was seeing those lives that were changed, and I was trying to fill those pews myself. And I was trying to do it all. And I remember having multiple conversations with people around me, primarily Carissa, but people around me, that I slowly started to notice that every sentence I said was an I statement. It was all about me. My world revolved around me, and it was nothing else. And it was only by the grace of God that I had the people in my lives that really cared about me and loved me and called me on it. And I started to learn that all this stuff that I had sought all my life was all about a broken theology, a broken, just brokenness, simple brokenness. And I finally got to, it's funny how God speaks to everybody. But it's interesting. I was talking to Doug Kellogg today about it, and we were talking about mediums that we all have. We all have our own medium with God. We all have our own way of communicating with him, where he speaks and we speak, and we can really communicate. And it was really cool having that conversation with him. And I was beginning to realize that I just lost my train of thought. Wow. This is the most help I've ever had when I said that. And I love you all, but none of it helped. That's fine. So I was getting to this. I was starting to accept this idea. I was starting to get to this this idea that I could be outside of the church and I could work outside of the church, and what that looked like. And it was hard. It was very, very hard. West Virginia was the hardest 2 years of my life, and I went through some hard stuff. And it wasn't hard because of I don't know. It was just hard. I was doing a lot. I was working a ton. Carissa was studying a ton. We weren't on the same page because we were doing those things, and it just left us alone. It left her alone. It left me alone. And I realized that in that, I needed to figure it out, or I was going to lose everything I had. And I started this journey. I started this I don't know, this growth mentality is what it is. And I realized in my brokenness that I was broken. I realized in my loneliness that I was lonely. And it was all because I felt like I had it together. And I felt like I knew what I was supposed to do. And through the process of learning and reading and seeking out mentorship, and I began to start to realize that I needed to step back from everything I wanted, everything that I thought I needed and I thought I was supposed to do, and I needed to just seek Jesus. And I remember my train of thought. My medium with God is interesting because oftentimes it comes when I'm right here, or when I'm having a conversation over the phone where I'm supposed to be mentoring the one on the phone, or something like that. It's like God's giving me something for that person, yes, but also for me. And I was having this conversation with my cousin, and he was in a similar situation where he was coming out of college and he was trying to figure out what his purpose in life was, what he was supposed to be doing. He didn't know. He really didn't have a degree or much of one, and he was trying to figure this out. And I remember what I was learning through this job that I had, and the awesome leadership in it, was that we all have a why we wake up in the morning, why we do this, why we go to work, why we do whatever we're doing. We have a core why, a purpose. And I had never really thought of this passage in this way, but the conversation between Peter and Jesus came to mind when Jesus was asking him, "Do you love me?" "Yes, of course, God, I love you." "Then feed my sheep." "Do you love me?" "Yes, of course, Jesus, I love you." "Then feed my sheep." And he asked one more time, and the answer was still, then feed my sheep. And for some reason, in this moment where I was speaking to Logan, my cousin, and trying to give him purpose, give him meaning, I was like, man, when it really comes down to it and we look at what Jesus had to say to his followers, to his people, the one singular time where he was direct was feed my sheep. And what God gave me through that, through reflecting on it and praying on it, and I don't know, just thinking on it, I realized that in anything we do, whatever paycheck we gain, wherever we live, whoever we're with, we are called to feed his sheep wherever we're at. And when I realized that, everything changed. Because I could be happy outside the church. I could be content. I could be all that God made me to be freely, without the bonds of the walls of a church building. And I could go out and I could do ministry, and it could be absolutely beautiful. And I began to do this about this same time. We've caught all the way up to about last year. About this time last year, and I ended up getting offered in the same company, Select Painting. I work for a paint company in Sioux Falls. And through this company, they offered me a sales position. And formerly, a sales position was not good for my selfishness and pride and egotism, because I was a people person and people like to buy stuff from me. And it blew my head up really big. And I treaded lightly in conversations and approaching this position, because honestly, when they first came to me, I was like, I don't even want to talk about it. You have other positions wide open. I don't even want to talk about the sales position. And it was because of me being in that journey of understanding that wasn't a good role for me in the past. And I was having these reflections and revelations in my life, and I realized that as long as I approached this position with an attitude of feeding his sheep, then I'd be fine, and it would be beautiful. And I realized also that if I fed his sheep, and I focused on that solely, nothing else, and I focused on his people and loving them and treating them as if they are more than a customer, more than a transaction, that God would bless that and it would blow up. And I for some reason, going into this position, I knew that it would be a beautiful thing, and I had just read a book called The Selfless Way of Christ, and it's by Henry Nouwen, and it was this crazy thought of how every piece of worldly success is bigger, better, more money, more power, more influence, and that's everything that I was seeking on my former path, correct? So then what Henry Nouwen introduced in this book was this idea that that's exactly opposite of what Jesus had done in his ministry. And what I mean by that is he started from heaven, right? And he came down. And he walked among us. And he gave up everything to do it. And then he decided to break bread with the worst of us. And he gave that up again. Yet, and people start to ask questions, right? The coolest example of this idea was my mentor was telling me about this, and he was like, it's just like the CEOs that go out there and they rake the leaves, or they serve in every possible way they can, and people start to ask, what's different about them? What I don't get it. And the heart of it is they're seeking a life with Christ, and they're not seeking worldly promotions and worldly success. And when we learn to follow a direction, so I don't have a chalkboard. I used it really cool at Zone 2, but so we have this success idea, right, in the world, and then what Christ's success looks like is a downward, so it makes an X. And there's this difference, and that's that question. So the further and further we get down, and we serve, and we make people more important than ourselves, then the more people start to ask that gap. They're like, what's different? And that's the point where you get to share why. You get to share, hey, this is why. This is who I'm following, Jesus Christ. And I'm following a God that loves me, and he served me even though he was at the highest heights. And I got that, and I went into this job with this beautiful understanding of that. And I won't go into a lot about this job, but the fact that I was finally content outside of the church, and I was finally living my calling outside the church and outside of myself. And that was something different. And I was finally getting to a point where I was content, and I was happy, and things were going well, and things were moving forward. And God entered in his funny way. At Select, part of my role is to go to a business networking group every week and pass referrals between each other. And every week you rotate through members, and they get like an 8-minute spot to kind of share a little bit about themselves, a little bit about the company and why you choose them, and all of this. Well, what is a youth pastor going to get up and talk about other than God? And so I took this opportunity. I actually forgot about it, and I get there, and they're like, "Oh, are you ready to speak?" And I'm just kind of chuckling inside. It was like, it's 8 minutes. I can fill 8 minutes. And I ended up sharing my story. I told them a lot about Select, but Select plays a big role in my story. And in that comes, there's a lot of youth ministry. There's a lot of education, things like that people see. Well, after it, a lady in the group came up to me, and she was like, "You ever thought about getting back in youth ministry?" And I was to a point at this point where I saw God doing things that were just funny to me, and because it was totally what I used to seek. It was everything that was the success I thought, but it was back then it was misplaced. Now it's right, and I just chuckled. I was like, "We can have that conversation." And for the first time in seeking youth ministry, and honestly, I've sought youth ministry since college, like I said. So Carissa's been there for every moment of that. And for the first time in seeking youth ministry, Carissa was on board. And I'm like, okay, God's doing something here, because she's got something wrong with the church. That was my feeling back in the day, and I just didn't get it. And little did I know it was all my blown perspective. And long story of this part short was I ended up accepting a part-time youth ministry position in a place that is really, really cool, and it has a really, really great potential, and we're really excited about it. And I say we, and I love that I say we. So all that to say, it was all because of this broken identity that I had. It was all because of this it was coming from this brokenness and selfishness and pride that I had never taken care of. And finally, when I did take care of it, God chose to put his finger on it. And that was the coolest thing to be a part of, and to continue to be a part of. And I learned that my identity was so much more than the brokenness of this world and the flesh, than the temptation. And it was actually Christ in me. That's my identity, Christ in me. And when I got to that point, God chose to give me everything I ever thought I wanted. And that was so cool, or never thought to want, and which was even better. And in that, I've learned a lot about the church. I've learned a lot about God's nature. I've learned a lot about what ministry really is, what a relationship with Christ really is. And I've come to some conclusions, some working conclusions, I think, that are pretty cool. And I think oftentimes we, as the church, as people, as individuals, as organizations, as CFO, I think we oftentimes we lose that identity in what success is, and what success is and what that looks like. And I think we forget that every single time God laid it down. He didn't want any of it, none of the glory. Every single time when you look at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, he's like, you don't say a word about what I just did. You do not say a word. And that doesn't make sense to us. It's like, do you realize what you could have conquered if you would have just let people know what you were doing? But no, he didn't, and it didn't make sense. And instead of riding in on a steed, a valiant white horse, he didn't. He rode in on a donkey, and it didn't make sense. And then we look at our world, and we look at what a good church is, a successful church. We look at what a good camp is. We look at what a good organization is, and we think bigger, better, more. And that's not it. And when we change the perspective and we decide to seek God and to seek his will, then CFO happens. And we've all experienced CFO. And we know what that is. We know the difference. And we get it. But you have to experience it, right? You have to be in it. You have to see it. And I remember I didn't go to the first CFO. I saw glimpses of it at Kansas CFO when Carissa was there. But that was in June of 2014. Well, Black Hills CFO doesn't meet until June of 2015. So I didn't experience CFO for a whole year. And I was looking at these people and I'm like, this is kind of weird. This is different. This isn't the Jesus I have sought all my life, and I don't get it. And there's subtle differences that I really want to figure out. And when I went to Black Hills CFO in June of 2015, a month before I was marrying somebody who had been in this camp all her life, I got to see. I got to meet with Jesus, and I got to see him in a way that I had never seen him before, and I remember I got nominated onto counseling, and I got nominated to lead youth. These people didn't even know me. And I got these nominations, and of course, at the time, I was still kind of in the darker place, but I was like, yes, of course, I would love to. And I remember it was a couple months before it would have been a year later, and Chris was like, hey, you need to read 3 books. I was like, what? She's like, you need to read 3 Glenn Clark books. I was like, okay, I guess I can read. I like to read. So I started reading these books, and I started meeting with this guy that was no longer here, and I got to see his heart. And I got to see what CFO really was and why it was the way it was. And I started to grow this passion, just a passion for everything that it was. And I was like, yeah, that's it. I remember reading through A Man's Reach, by the way. That was what I quoted out of in the very beginning. I remember reading through that book. I borrowed it from somebody in Nashville, and I still have the book. I haven't sent it back yet. And just realizing that there was something different, and that it was this beautiful style of camp, of love of Jesus, of seeking Him outside our world, to practice. That's the difference, to practice. So we could go back and play. And I got that. I was an athlete. I got practice, and I get this idea of athleticism in the Spirit, and it spoke to me. And he started to coach me, is what he did, through his books. And I was like, yeah, I can do that. I can do that. And then we got to lead that year, and I got to do my first night mission. And Cameron Geary was there. Seth, were you in that group? They beat my night mission quick. The night missions last, you guys know night missions. They last a long time. And this took them like 10 minutes. They were done. And I was just like, oh my gosh, I'm such a failure. This is bad. And I remember, if you've ever been to Camp Judson out in the Black Hills, there's an old chapel, and that was kind of like home base for the end of the game. And that's where they were all trying to get. That was the ending point. And I remember it's kind of a hike up there, and we're in the middle of the night, and I was by myself, and I was like, oh man, what am I going to say to these kids? What am I going to do? And God, just come in. Just take over, because I obviously can't do this. And God spoke in a way that I never knew He could through me. And it was all because I took those steps of stepping out on the way up. And yeah, it was 10 minutes, but then we hung out for about an hour up on the top of the hill in the middle of the night, and we got to meet with God. And it was just this beautiful thing. And I think really when it comes down to, again, in my conversation with Doug today, they were praying. Doug and Jesse were praying for me as I left them at the airport. And at that point, I had not decided what I was speaking on tonight. And some words that Doug shared in his prayer, he said, I pray that he gets to the root. He gets to it. God, let him get to it. And that did it. I knew exactly what I was doing. And it comes to an identity. What is CFO? Who is CFO? What does that look like? A true root, a core. What is it? And I thought about it. And I've thought about it now for a few years. What is different about this place? And I think it's simply, I'm going to take my friends and I'm going to invite Jesus to be there. I'm going to see what he does. And we're going to sit in it. And we're going to see him and meet with him and talk with him. And he's going to teach us. And we're going to rest. Thank God we're going to rest. And we're going to prepare. We're going to practice. And we're going to become these champions for Christ in this world that doesn't get it. That's the core. That's the root. And when we can get to that, no matter what we do, no matter the camp, no matter the setting, no matter what we do, if we can meet with Jesus and we can learn from him and we can put it into our everyday life, we've got it. And we'll hold on to it and we'll hold it tight and we'll treasure it for as long as God does it. And I think he's going to do it for a long time. That's the beautiful thing. I just love to, at this point, where I'm at with God is we were talking about this in prayer group yesterday, and what I've done is I've gotten out of driving my old Mustang, because I used to have a Mustang and I sold it, and I got out of driving it, right? I loved driving that car. I got out of driving it, and I just jumped onto a motorcycle that God's driving. And I got to feel that. And I got to feel the wind in my hair, and I got to feel every piece of that. And it wasn't because I was driving, it was because God was. And I was experiencing something that I had never experienced before. And that is CFO. God, I just thank you for showing up. I thank you for taking everything that I had planned to say and making it yours. I thank you for meeting us in this place. I thank you for guiding us and teaching us and helping us through and coaching us so we can go to all the world, every single corner of the world, and we can feed your sheep. Amen.